Well, welcome back to our series with Michael Warner. And we're looking at the question, how did we get to the place today where Christianity is actually thought to be a relatively negative thing in our society? And it's kind of like the red pill, blue pill situation where it seems that people have the blue pill is swallowing this idea that Christianity has had a very negative impact on history and is not something we want today in our culture. The reality, however, when you actually look at history, is radically different. And Michael here is just working through history and some of the major areas of science and education and so forth to show what Christianity has actually done. And it turns out it's actually quite beneficial. Now, we will get to the negative things that we hear about today, not today, but we are coming to those in future episodes. So, welcome back, Michael. And I'm looking forward to continuing on this area. And I think we're going to start with, looking at rational thinking and then move into science and education.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. I enjoy our times together and the opportunity to share what I've been learning with others. So, we are trying to set the record straight on this. And last time we were able to focus in on the positive impact of Christianity in terms of healthcare and the origin of hospitals. We also briefly looked at the enhanced status of women and children. And now, third, we're going to move into I've grouped three things together: reason, progress, and science. And how those three um, were strongly influenced by Christianity, which would be a surprise to most people, I think.
Yeah, in fact, just this week, somebody posted that they credited with atheism as actually originating this idea of critical thinking and that it's completely absent in Christianity. And he challenged the Christian, can you provide any evidence whatsoever that Christianity has been a positive influence on, reason and
Yeah,
rational thinking?
yeah. It
So,
sounds like that person has drank from the cup of the dark ages, and we're trying to set the record straight on that.
mm,
So, when Europeans first began to explore the globe, the greatest surprise they had was not the existence of a Western hemisphere, but the extent of their own technological superiority over the rest of the world. So, why is it that although many civilizations have pursued alchemy, the study led to chemistry only in Europe? Why was it that for centuries Europeans were the only ones who had eyeglasses, chimneys, reliable clocks, heavy cavalry, or a system of music notation? How had the nations that had arisen from the rubble of a defeated Rome so greatly surpassed the rest of the world? And one of the scholars that I have been accessing is Rodney Stark, passed away about a year ago. He was the professor of sociology at Baylor. And as I think I mentioned last time, he began his research into the social impact of Christianity as an agnostic. And because of the positive impact that he found, actually became a Christian believer. So, according to Stark, he says the West became history's most successful civilization because of the unique theology that undergirded Western culture. Christian theology was both rational and progressive. Now, I mean, to say that in our culture right now is to say the opposite of what most people have been taught and think. Christian theology is both rational and progressive. Now, this is in contrast, especially to the Greek religion. Greek religion was all about mystery, and if things were logically inconsistent, that was even better proof that they were of divine origin. Whereas Christians had this strange notion of progress from the very beginning, that God can only reveal himself to us consistent with our capacity to understand, and we can thereby increase our capacity to understand, and thus over time we will understand God better and make progress. While the other world religions emphasize mystery, Christianity alone embraced reason and logic as the primary guides to religious truth about the world. I mean, Jesus Christ himself is called the Logos, which is the rational concept underlying the world in Greek thinking. What about science? How did Christianity help develop Western science? Well, Stark says through a mode of thought and reason where you think things can be explained. The belief that reason was the supreme gift of God encouraged inquiry, not only in the matters of faith, but the whole natural world as well. And so the reason you have people like Isaac Newton, who could search for the laws of the universe and laws of science, is because they believed such laws were there. In most of the world, theologians taught they weren't there. The universe was inexplicable, an inexplicable mystery, or that life was just one great repeating cycle. But if you believe that we have a rational creator, then presumably there are immutable laws to be looked for, and progress will be possible. So setting the record straight involves correcting the notion that science and Christianity are inherent enemies. Science would never have developed without Christianity's assumptions about an intelligible God, as a matter of fact, an intelligible universe, and the importance of reason. How many atheists do you think were key figures in the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries? What do you think, Kirk?
Oh man, 16th and 17th. Not in the area of science. I can't think of any in the area of science. No, that doesn't mean there weren't any, but I know there were atheists then, but they seem to be more in the area of philosophy and literature. But
exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right. There really weren't any. Virtually 100% of the founders of modern science were theists of a Christian variety. So leading figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Kepler, Lavoisier, Faraday, and many more saw themselves as cultivating a scientific method that was completely compatible with Christian thinking. Science actually grew in the soil of Christian theology, Christian understanding, like God creating an intelligible world with laws of nature that could be studied, and human beings who were created in the image of this God have the power of reason to investigate and take better care of God's creation. And Christians have continued in the forefront of science up to present day, although I'm focusing more on the medieval period here. I think it's interesting to note that in a review of all Nobel Prize winners in science since the Nobel Prize's inception in 1901, overwhelmingly, the people who have won in the science area are Christians, self-identified as Christians. 73% of the winners in chemistry, 65% of the winners in physics, 62% of the winners in medicine, self-identifying as Christians. So this idea that science and Christianity are incompatible or somehow in intrinsic conflict just doesn't fit history, doesn't fit the data.
I just have to smile when people say that to me in personal conversation, because I have a PhD in biophysics, specializing in the information and coding the protein structure. And I find that science is our tool to understand how nature works. And like you say, our earliest book in the Bible seems to indicate that God has created laws of nature that govern the universe and the earth. So in no way at all has it hindered even my own personal experience in the sciences. If anything, I love to do that. In fact, there's another verse in the Psalm says that great are your works, O Lord, they are studied by all who delight in them. It's actually, science is actually a good thing. It's encouraged by God, both by the existence of laws of nature that allow science to even happen. And secondly, it's almost an act of worship with me. It's finding out how this world works according to the laws of nature that God has designed. So I'm a scientist, and it hasn't in the least. if anything, it's encouraged my love of science and study of nature.
Exactly. I mean, you're following in the lines of these, the originators of science. And yeah, you're a great example of that. So this desire to explore God's created world was the impulse that gave rise to Christians who were the majority of the early scientists producing what we now know as the scientific method. Now, some people will say, wait a minute, well, what about Galileo? We will come to the negative, and we're not trying to whitewash anything here because we're just focusing for the moment on the positive impact, because trying to set the record straight, which the current record is that, Christianity is harmful and has done no good. So we're trying to set the record straight by highlighting the positive. But we will have to admit that there has been negative that has happened, and we will come back to that in a later session. But I want to move now from reason, progress, and science to kind of the offspring of that, which is education, and especially the formation of universities were a result of Christian influence. This Christian view of reason and progress and science gave rise to the medieval universities. And this is not, this fits perfectly with the very origin of Christianity. Christians have been committed to teaching from its earliest days. Jesus was considered a great teacher. Luke tells us in the book of Acts that the early apostles never stopped teaching. And one of the qualifications that the Apostle Paul set out for a church leader is to be able to teach. And it makes sense. If God has revealed himself and wants to be known, and known not just by the elite or the rich or the clergy, then real knowledge is possible, and children should be treated as learners and knowers. So the church continued its emphasis on teaching. By the end of the first century, it had established documents and manuals like the Didache, which was essentially an instruction manual for new believers. Eventually, schools sprung up in Ephesus, Rome, and Alexandria, where mathematics and medicine and grammar were added to doctrinal instruction. So we're not talking only about theological instruction here. And these, to sort of summarize, later morphed into monasteries, which became kind of learning centers. And they were the embryonic universities, which provided the academic footing for the next phase, what we know as universities. And so
I don't know if you're going to cover this,
Christian invention. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to cover this, and
we're going to go into some more detail now about this, but yeah, go ahead.
But back to the monasteries, I think a lot of people don't realize that many, if not the majority, of our ancient copies of literature, whether it's not just the Bible or Bible manuscripts, but also things like Plato and Socrates and so forth, these manuscripts that we have today are actually copies made by monks in monasteries in the medieval times.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the points I was going to make today, and I cut out just because I didn't think I had enough time, and I was going to save it for the negative discussion, because there is the criticism out there that Christians destroyed learning and they burnt the libraries and all that sort of stuff, right? So, but you're absolutely right. The record is actually quite different.
Yeah, so, much of what we know today about the ancient world, we would not have had it not been for these monks in medieval times faithfully trying to copy fragments and what they had and reproduce them, which those are the things we have today.
Absolutely. So let's look in a little bit more detail how this idea kind of universities came out of Christianity, of education and universities. So I've mentioned the name John Dickson before. He's an Australian historian. He's an evangelical Christian. And his book, Bullies and Saints, I highly recommend. I'm going to take some of what he said from his analysis. He says, learning about God's world is in itself an act of worship for Christians, because, and you just finished saying the very same thing, because it's
Yeah.
searching out the signs of God's own wisdom imprinted on creation. So learning about the motion of the planets, animals, logic, and for you, proteins and enzymes in your work that we do now was a fulfillment of the ancient biblical command to love the Lord your God with all your mind. That is part of the Judeo-Christian DNA, so to speak. And Dixon talks about an approach to knowledge that was called wisdom theology, and it was the norm among Christian theologians in the period following the New Testament. And he goes through a list here. I'm not going to read them all, but a list of Christian leaders and teachers from the 2nd century, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, and shows that all of them valued secular learning, not just theological learning, but secular learning as a window, even if it's sometimes or often an opaque window, into God's wisdom imprinted on the world. So when you're studying the world, you're studying nature, you're studying about God from a Christian perspective.
Absolutely. And it's almost inseparable for me. It's not only in the area of science, it's and in my area with proteins, it's not just that. I've also have a large telescope that I haul out, and I just like to look at way out there, especially the planets and the galaxies. And it seems to me that I see the invisible attributes of God. There's something there about the beauty and the grandeur. And then I practice nature photography, and again, I go out there, and it's an act of worship for me. It's an act of being alone with God, just doing nature photography. The piano behind me, I'm not a good piano player, but I do enjoy playing it because I think music is also something that has originates in God. We can twist it and misuse it, of course, but everywhere we look and everything that has to do with education that moves us up higher, and it moves us up also closer to God, I think.
Yeah. So in around the year 200, if you wanted to become a baptized member of the church, you had to do 3 years of schooling with an authorized teacher once a week outside of a weekly church service. So just to get started in the faith, that's a minimum of 144 hours of lectures.
That's a bit much. I don't think Jesus
yeah.
quite had that in mind.
No.
He wants it more accessible, but I appreciate, the value they
intention
put on
here, yeah.
education.
So 100 years later, in the 300s, there was a faster, more intense approach to studies, 3 hours of lessons each day, 6 days a week for 7 weeks leading up to Easter. So, they're evolving the education, process. But I want to highlight a particular person in this area, and his name is Bishop Elquin. He was an archbishop, but he was a scholar. He was a leader. He was called the most learned man anywhere to be found. And he was a teacher, or the main teacher of many of the dominant intellectuals of the Carolingian Renaissance. That's a time in the 8th century when Charlemagne was king of the Roman Empire. And Alcuin was Charlemagne's main teacher. And he once wrote to Charlemagne that nothing is more important for life and leadership, and here's the quote, than the beauty of wisdom, the praise of learning, and the advantages of scholarship. This is the type of influence the church was having on culture, studying grammar, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, music, astronomy, and all the rest was considered an act of devotion to the all-wise God from Alcuin's perspective. It was learning about the wisdom that the Creator had imprinted upon the world. And so it involved knowing not just the Bible, but also the ancient Greek and Roman classical authors, And we know from Alcuin's own letters and writing that it included studying Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Pliny the Elder, Horace, Cicero, Seneca, and a list of about 60 other Roman and Greek authors. So, under the influence of Bishop Alcuin, Charlemagne, who had been trying to spread Christianity by the sword, because he was just following kind of the Roman example of how you spread authority and power and influence. And Bishop Alcuin called him on that and said, no, you need to use persuasion, not force, and actually convinced Charlemagne to make his major focus to move from being a military general and leader to being the greatest, not teacher himself, but leader of teachers, the leader, educational leader. And Charlemagne fully grasped that under the influence of Alcuin. And so Charlemagne laid down clear demands. Go ahead, and then I'll quote him in a second.
No, just continue, and then I want to jump in on this. Finish
All
your
right.
thought on Charlemagne.
So here's what Charlemagne said in the 8th century. Since it is our concern that the condition of our churches should always advance towards better things, we strive with vigilant zeal to repair the manufactory, just think factory of learning, almost destroyed by the sloth of our forefathers. And he says, and we can summon what we can, even by our own example, to master the studies of liberal arts, and for both boys and girls. And that's what happened in the 8th century and following.
Okay, no, I think I just want to emphasize this is huge because Charlemagne wasn't just, some fellow down the street who, a neighbor who had very little impact on history here. He actually switched from being more of an aggressive military approach to an approach that really promoted Christianity. And in other words, not Christianity, well, that too, but I mean education and the things you've just mentioned. But that essentially it's got to have had a massive impact, future impact, spreading out from Charlemagne. He basically changed the course of history at that point on the advice of Alcuin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the point that we want to make here. And Dixon kind of sums it up. He says, the story of the Dark Ages, in quotes, when the church suppressed knowledge, is a fiction developed in modern times, he says. The tale is rarely contradicted today because so few of us learn about medieval Europe. Why would we bother? It was the Dark Ages. And so, he's being pretty sarcastic here, but that's part of what we're trying to do, is set the record straight. Education was a priority in early Christianity. A scholar named McKitterick says this vibrant new culture of the late 8th and 9th centuries provided the essential foundation for European culture thereafter. Okay, so now we're looking at, now after Charlemagne, and this foundation was really improved in the 8th century. What happened? Well, within a couple hundred years, Pope Gregory VII decreed that every cathedral in Christendom should establish a school for its region, and the Universal Church Councils of the years 1179 and 1215 reiterated the demand, adding an economic requirement that even penniless students should be taught. That's powerful too. Yeah. And so the tradition of advanced education established by Alcuin, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry and astronomy, and then history, science, and theology, set an educational pattern in Europe on and off for the next 1,000 years.
That's massive, just massive when you think about the impact that would have had and has had on the future. If you go back in time to that back then, standing at that point in history, 1079, 1179, 1215, and they had no idea, I suppose, of what impact this would have in the future. But this is massive. This really sets education up. It gives it a huge jump start because the church was a very powerful entity. And if this powerful entity saw the importance of education. And we're not just talking religious education here. We're talking
Right.
about, as you said, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, and so forth.
Exactly.
If it saw that as not just a priority, but it actually launched this, and not just for the wealthy elite, but to emphasize even the penniless students, that's huge. That has
Yeah.
got to have changed the history in a very positive and beneficial way.
And boys and girls. Unfortunately, not completely equal, not
Yeah.
completely, but to involve girls at all coming out of
Hmm.
ancient civilizations was an amazing step forward. So now this led to actual universities in the 11th or 12th century, in the 1100s. So in Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, all the universities that were formed in those places owe a debt to the educational ambitions of the medieval church that we just finished looking at. Indeed, Oxford's motto remains, and I won't try to pronounce the Latin, but the English translation is the motto: "The Lord is my light. The Lord is my light." And that's concrete testimony to the tradition of education going back to Alcuin, and before him to the church fathers, and before them to the classics of Greeks and Rome. And Alcuin, with the royal patron Charlemagne, was indeed the real swerve in Western culture. Now, the reason he used the word swerve there is he's actually countering a book written by another person that argued that the Renaissance and Enlightenment times was the real time when history took a turn. But Dixon says, no, that happened before. That happened before.
Hmm.
And what happened with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment was just a continuation of that curve that was moving forward.
It would be interesting to take a look at today's universities and see. I've read some recent articles. By recent, I mean even in the last week or so, that there's a concern that today's universities have really started to deteriorate in the quality of thinking that's going on there, as well as becoming more susceptible to, let's say, polemic, current cultural
Activism. Yeah.
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 And there's a correlation there, because now I think the universities have swallowed, or many have swallowed, this idea that Christianity is a negative thing and is doing pretty much everything they can to sideline it, to put it out of the classroom, or to even speak badly about it. But as we observe this trend in the university to distance itself from theological commitments and theological beliefs, we're also seeing a trend going in the opposite direction of what we witnessed, say, in the Middle Ages here, the birth of universities and higher learning.
Right.
Now, correlation doesn't mean causation, of course, but it should be pointed out that there is a correlation here, both in the past with Christianity and increasing education, and in the present with the pushback against Christianity and the deterioration of higher learning. There's a correlation there, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because again, I want to put all that we're saying here in a broader context of my purposes. My purpose is not just to show that Christianity did a whole bunch of positive things and go, yay, Christians are great. That's not it. My purpose is to say, wait a minute, if history actually shows us, accurate history shows us, that Christianity has had a amazingly positive transformational impact, where it's been practiced, or even where the worldview has been present, then how should we be thinking about Christianity now? If we set the record straight and realize that, hey, we've been taught a myth that Christianity has actually been harmful and there was dark ages, and that's not true. It never was true. Christianity is actually much more of a transformative, in a positive sense, transformational idea. Then how should we live now in light of that knowledge is where we're going to get to. But it's always helpful to kind of keep putting that in as I'm going through this.
Yeah.
So
we know where we're going with
Let's
this.
just summarize this education section here with this final point. George Marsden is a well-known evangelical scholar, and he's a specialist in American religion and culture, professor of history at Notre Dame. He asserts that from their earliest beginnings of monastic roots through to the 19th century, all universities were founded as Christian institutions, regardless of whether they taught law, theology, or medicine, and all operated within theological boundaries. And by the way, I did a little study in Canada about that, just a kind of a quick review as much as I could to see the origin of all the universities in Canada. And virtually all of them, except for one or two, had theological origins as well.
Yeah, strong correlation there.
Yeah. So positive impact in the area of education and the origin of universities. Now, the next one I want to focus on is moral equality. The whole idea of human equal value, worth, and dignity, and the human rights that come from it. And this actually might be the most important change that Christianity has made. And if I was only given time to present one thing, this would be it. This would be the one. And I did mention last time that this is kind of based on a different view of what God is or who God is, that this is a God of love and mercy, not some sort of capricious juvenile delinquent like the pagan gods of Greece and Rome. And secondly, that human beings were created in the image of this God, a God of love and mercy and reason. And so, given that human beings were created in the image of this God, and given that God is a God of love and mercy and reason, what can we find out? Well, Christianity is known for the John 3:16 quote from the book of John that says, "For God so loved the world." That's how it begins. Well, that phrase, "For God so loved the world," just would puzzle educated pagans. Like, what? God so loved the world? Because as Aristotle taught, the gods could feel no love for mere humans. The gap between the gods and humans, there was no love there at all. And a God of mercy was unthinkable, because classical philosophers actually taught that mercy was a defect of character, which was picked up by Nietzsche in the 19th century, by the way, but that's another story. So most sophisticated pagans would also dismiss the notion that the gods care about how we treat one another. That would be absurd. They couldn't care less. But the Christian God does. When we examine the pagan gods, they seem frivolous in contrast with God the Father, and they seem like wicked incompetence compared to Jesus, his son. And to many pagans, this new teaching wasn't just new and radically different, it was also good news, because this was a God of love. I mean, that could lead us into a whole presentation of the gospel. But let's just come back to just the idea of moral value, human value, worth, dignity, and human rights. See, Christianity taught that all were equal in the eyes of God. And this is based on the Imago Dei, which is the teaching in the book of Genesis, the first book of the scriptures, that human beings were created in the image of this God, God of love, reason, and mercy. And also the New Testament teaching, where the Apostle Paul wrote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And by the way, this is not an ontological statement he was making here, that there is no such thing as male or female. He was writing about the context of authority and power and influence in a culture. And is one group or better than another? And no, not Jew nor Gentile, not slave nor free, nor male nor female is better than another or better than the other. You are all one in Christ Jesus. But because everyone could be all one in Christ Jesus, there was equality. amongst people. At least there should be. Now, of course, there's always going to be a fight from within each of us and our fallen nature and our own self-centeredness. And of course, Christians haven't always treated everybody equally, but that is the teaching of Jesus. And when it's applied, it makes a huge difference. So
It essentially defines the value. I see a value there. And it's not that one person is more valuable than another in the eyes of God. We tend to think one person is more valuable than other people and so forth, but God actually speaks quite harshly against that kind of thinking. I'm thinking of the book of James, where he says we tend to treat wealthy people better than people who are very poor. But from his perspective, the value comes not in how wealthy you are or how amazing you look, but your value is contingent on the fact, he says, that you are created in his own image and likeness. That's where your value and your significance is based. And once we realize that, I know it affects me all the time. I'm watching something and I see somebody not very likable doing a terrible thing. And, I just have, what would I do? Like, even if I put myself in the case of a judge or a police officer arresting that person, and there would be a tendency to maybe treat that person harshly, but then I remember, but how would God want me to treat this person, given that he values that person as he values me? It's a sobering thought, and it has crossed my mind countless times on a daily basis almost. How would God want me to treat that person, given that person is how he is valued or she is valued by God?
Exactly. And so this biblical view provides the foundation for universal human rights. And the equality of every individual and the idea of human rights were not developed by the philosophers of the Enlightenment, but by Christian canon lawyers in the 12th century. It takes time for the Christian worldview to have an impact. That's one of the things that I've learned, especially in my study. It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes centuries. And, by the 12th century, Christian canon lawyers, based on their understanding of Genesis and us being created in the image of God, began to develop thinking about human rights. And our current belief in human rights comes from that. And what happened in the Enlightenment was building upon that was already there. Another area is the area of sexual activity. The idea that every person has a right to his or her own body, and that therefore sex must be completely consensual, was a radically new concept that came into the world. Sorry, got a phone call. Sorry about that. That was
That's
a radical
real life.
new concept that came into the world through Christianity. In the pagan world, the powerful had the right to do what they want to do other people's bodies who did not have that same sort of power.
Well, that's true. I'm often struck by that one statement that when we use another person for our own sexual gratification, God says, you're defrauding that person and you are accountable to him. You've wronged the other person, but God, you've actually failed to realize that the person you were using has a value there that is unquantifiable in the sight of God. And that's, again, a sobering thing when it comes to sexual relationships.
For sure. So being created in the image of God helped lay the foundation for moral equality, value, worth, and human rights. But another key impact of Christianity in this area was the example of Jesus himself, the humility of Jesus, and of course his self-sacrifice on the cross. He was an example of humility, humble self-sacrifice, yet he was God in the flesh. In the view of the earliest Christians, Christians followed his example. People of high social status were buried right beside people of low social status. This happened very early in Christianity. And then the low point of the cross, like the cross was the worst form of torture known at that time. It was the symbol of power. It was the way that Rome kept everybody under their foot, under their thumb. And Christians inverted that symbol. And actually, it's made the cross the weirdest symbol we can imagine. This Roman symbol of ultimate torture, humiliation, and power over the oppressed and the slave is inverted to become a symbol of love and care. I mean, that is so crazy. I mean, that's why a lot of people who have no idea the history, why do Christians have this symbol of torture as the symbol of their religion? It's because Jesus willingly, self-sacrificially hung on that cross to pay the penalty for our sins. And so you see the cross on hospitals. Next time that we get together, we're going to talk about the Red Cross and the Geneva Convention, and countless relief organizations. I mean, the cross was just inverted as a symbol. So let me just finish off this section here with a quote from Rebecca McLaughlin. She's written a number of really good books looking at the history of Christian impact, and one book called Confronting Christianity. She says, faith in a loving, rational God who created humans in his image and calls us to love both our neighbor and our enemy is not only the historical source of our beliefs about human equality, but also their best justification. And yet, Christians can make no claim to innate moral superiority. To be a Christian is to acknowledge your utter moral failure and to throw yourself on the mercy of the only truly good man who ever lived. So I like the way she emphasized there sort of the triumph of the Christian idea leads to human equality, but that doesn't mean Christians are superior people. We do acknowledge our utter moral failure and throw ourselves upon the mercy of God. Now, Kirk, I think we should probably cut it off right here, given our time constraints.
Sure.
My goal would be to move on to the abolition of slavery, and I'll just leave a little bit here. The abolition of slavery has happened twice, and only twice, in the history of the human race, and Christianity was the cause in both occasions. So we will come to that.
That's an excellent teaser there, Michael, because slavery is actually one of the things leveled against, at least the Bible, but we'll come back to that later. But this is huge. Yeah, thanks for sharing what you did today. There's a lot more I know. I've seen some of the stuff that you do. But thanks again, Michael, and we're going to look forward to next week or the next episode where you dive into the slavery and the abolition of slavery, the influence of Christianity.
I want to emphasize none of this is me. I'm just passing on what other scholars have done, and I encourage you, if this is interesting to you, if you want to dive deep, Bullies and Saints by John Dickson, The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener, or if you want to really read deeply, Dominion by Tom Holland, 700-page tome. And all three of those books are so well written. They're interesting, and you'll learn the same stuff that I'm passing on here.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Michael, and we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll see you on the next episode.
All right. Bye, Kirk.